All right, so welcome in everybody. I see a lot of familiar names as attendees, a lot of people who I haven't been able to see in person in a long time. So to all the people out there, I miss you guys, and hopefully sometime soon here in Kentucky, we can meet again face to face. I'm going to do just a quick welcome here, and then we'll get started right into our webinar. I want to say first, I know a lot of us are sort of zoomed out and sick of doing virtual calls and virtual meetings, and so I do really appreciate everybody taking some time to join us today, again with the hope that sooner rather than later we'll be back in person and doing the great work that we all do to improve Kentucky. Before we get in, I want to say that if there are things you hear today that are interesting to you, that you want to learn more about, that are interesting and that you want to be engaged in, please reach out. Most of you should have my email or phone number. I try to be as accessible as possible, so you can email me at Jared, Jared, like the jewelry store, at pegasuskentucky.org, and reach out with questions, comments, if you want to engage in any way, whether that's as a financial donor or engage as a partner on policy issues. Please do not hesitate to reach out. As we work through this, there's a Q&A section we have down here, so put your questions or comments in there, or you can text me or email me. I got my phone right here too. But with that all being said, I am excited to welcome our friends in from London, and I'm going to pass it off to our executive director, Josh Crawford, to introduce our panelists and our webinar today. So Josh, here you go.
Thanks, Jared. This is also probably the public debut of your mustache to a lot of these people, and so it's a big day for you as well. Welcome everyone to what is hopefully our last virtual event. I'm excited to be able to share the work of our friends at the Legatum Institute in London, in particular their Prosperity Index. The Legatum Institute is a London-based think tank with a bold vision to create a global movement of people committed to creating the pathways from poverty to prosperity and the transformation of society. If you're at all like me, you're already a bit skeptical. Here in Kentucky, UK is the University of Kentucky, home of the Women's Volleyball National Champions, and London is home of the World Fried Chicken Festival. What could the losing side of the Revolutionary War possibly want with the Commonwealth of Kentucky? Also, if you're like me, you see a lot of prosperity indexes, and nearly all of them center around one thing: economic freedom. Don't get me wrong, I love economic freedom, and I think it's crucial to prosperity and human flourishing. But so is freedom from the threat of violent crime. So is access to a high-quality education. So is the protection of fundamental rights. So are stable communities and relationships with your neighbor. If you're familiar with our work here at Pegasus, you know we care about these issues and more, and we care about data. Our district data dashboard looks at some of the Commonwealth's most pressing issues, and I'm pleased today to be able to announce our 2040 project. Pegasus Institute's 2040 project will look into the areas where Kentucky lags our regional neighbors. Many of them are areas we'll talk about today, and propose solutions so that Kentucky can reach her full potential by the year 2040. But there'll be more on that in the weeks and months to come. Now, without further ado, it's my pleasure to welcome both Ed and Sean from Legatum.
Great. Thank you so much, Josh and Jared, for such a kind introduction, and thank you to the Pegasus Institute for collaborating with us on this. And good afternoon to you all. My name is Ed Wickstead, and I'm a researcher at the Legatum Institute. And before we jump into what the United States Prosperity Index tells us about Kentucky, which, after all, that's why we're all here, we thought it'd be first useful to explain who we are, although Jared has and Josh have given a very good overview themselves, but also to talk about what we mean by prosperity. As Josh was pointing out, to us it means a lot more than just financial well-being. So who are we? The Legatum Institute, as Josh mentioned, is a London-based think tank. And our overarching mission is to create a global movement of people committed to creating pathways from poverty to prosperity for individuals, communities, and nations alike. To achieve this, we've spent the last 14 years developing our expertise in tracking, measuring, and analyzing what makes countries prosperous, and then working across the globe to bring together experts and policymakers to formulate data-driven policy responses. And the United States Prosperity Index is a key part of that product suite. So that's a brief overview of who we are and what we do. Now on to what prosperity is. I've already mentioned, as has Josh, that the term prosperity has very strong connotations of material wealth and financial well-being. However, we feel that this unidimensional view misses out on so many of the things that we believe are so crucial to a fulfilling life. Josh mentioned high quality education, freedom from violent crime, and the list goes on and on. It's both economic and social well-being working together in tandem. And if you're curious about finding out more, we do invite you to watch a short video which goes into more detail, and there'll be a link to that video posted in the chat. So now onto the structure of the index, which will give much more of a flavor about the breadth of measures that we bring into this index. And I know this is quite a complex diagram, but don't worry if you can't read all of the text. To start, we'll just focus on the innermost two rings. On the innermost ring, we have our what we call our domains of prosperity, and these are large, overarching organizational structures. So first off, we have the inclusive societies domain. That's on the left and in the blue, which captures the relationship structures that exist within a society between and among individuals and broader institutions. So firstly, the safety and security pillar measures the degree to which terrorism, violent crime, and property crime destabilize the security of individuals, both immediately, but also through longer lasting effects. Our personal freedom pillar measures progress towards basic legal rights, individual liberties, and social tolerance. The governance pillar measures the extent to which there are checks and restraints on power, and whether the government operates effectively and without corruption. And finally, in this domain, we have the social capital pillar, which measures the strength of personal and social relationships, institutional trust, and social and civic participation. In the center, we have the open economies domain, which captures the extent to which an economy is open to competition, encourages innovation and investment, promotes business and trade, and facilitates inclusive growth. So first up, our business environment pillar measures the setup for setting up new businesses, how easy it is to do that, business infrastructure, access to finance and credit, as well as labor market flexibility. The market access and infrastructure pillar looks at the quality of the infrastructure that facilitates that trade, from telecommunications infrastructure to transport infrastructure, and the availability of resources such as electricity. And finally, the economic quality pillar measures how well the economy is equipped to generate wealth sustainably and with the full engagement of its workforce. And last, but by no means least, is the empowered people domain, which captures the quality of people's lived experience and aspects that enable individuals to reach their full potential through autonomy and self-determination. So first up, the living conditions pillar measures the degree to which a reasonable quality of life is experienced by all, including material resources such as poverty rates, shelter, basic services, and connectivity. The health pillar measures the health of the population and looks not only at their illness and risk factors, but also their access to the services to maintain good health, as well as health outcomes, both physical and mental. The education pillar looks at access to and the quality of education, right the way from pre-K through to tertiary education and beyond to the education level of the adult population. And finally, the natural environment pillar measures the aspects of the physical environment that have an immediate impact on people in their daily lives, but also those that impact the prosperity of future generations. So underpinning each of these pillars is a number of policy-focused elements. And we developed these in conjunction with over 40 experts from across the US, specialists in a wide variety of fields, which you can see, if not read, on the outermost ring of this diagram. Our experts have been invaluable in helping us understand how prosperity manifests in the American context, as well as providing guidance on the best metrics and data sets to use. Their biographies are available on our website. So to summarize, we have an index of the 50 states and DC that's been specifically structured to be useful to policymakers. These 48 policy-focused elements are organized into 11 pillars of prosperity and are underpinned by more than 200 separate indicators from a wide range of sources, with data ranging back up to 10 years. And before I hand over to my colleague Sean, we want to share with you a short video outlining the key findings from our 2020 report.
The United States Prosperity Index provides a holistic picture of how prosperity was distributed across the 50 states of the Union and Washington, D.C., as well as 829 counties in 8 selected states for the 10 years preceding the coronavirus pandemic. It shows that prior to COVID-19, U.S. prosperity had been rising and was at its highest ever level. However, prosperity was not equally distributed across the country. Northern states outperformed those in the South, with Massachusetts topping the rankings and Mississippi at the bottom. Prosperity was also distributed very differently within individual states. While some states, like Iowa, saw similar levels of prosperity across all counties, others, like California, had much greater variation and represented a microcosm of the U.S. as a whole. Broadly speaking, urban counties were more prosperous than their rural counterparts, but rural counties were safer and had stronger social networks, while urban counties had better economic performance and social well-being. The growth in America's prosperity was mainly driven by more open economies. Among other factors, states became more productive and improved their fiscal sustainability. For example, Wyoming increased its financial reserves by over 300%, so could survive for 280 days longer by 2020 than 10 years earlier. Living conditions, health, education, and the natural environment had all also improved since 2010. But while the US has seen improvements over the last decade, which can provide a strong foundation as the country charts its way out of the COVID-19 pandemic and grapples with civil unrest, there are warning signs at national, state, and local levels that need to be addressed. The weakening of social capital is a serious threat to future prosperity, as strong and inclusive communities and institutions are the cornerstones of society. Across the US, social networks, trust in institutions, and civic and social participation have all weakened. For example, in Missouri, time spent volunteering fell by almost 1/3, from an average of 37 hours to 26 hours per person. Mental health had also deteriorated significantly in the decade before the pandemic started, and there had been a large rise in the number of suicides and drug overdose deaths, particularly in areas such as West Virginia and Colorado, with Pueblo County especially badly affected. Education had also weakened in the last year, with states such as Alaska, Montana, and North Dakota seeing a decline in test scores for reading, math, and science in the 4th and 8th grades. This is a concern as the pandemic resulted in many school closures, which may exacerbate further decline. Our analysis shows that the key to unlocking greater prosperity lies in the potential for improvement at a state and county level, and not just nationally. By learning from and building upon each other's strengths, every U.S. state and county can further develop inclusive societies, open economies, and empowered people, and drive greater levels of prosperity for all Americans. To find out more about how the index can help and to explore the rankings in more detail, please visit our website.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's
Sean, sorry to butt in. Would you mind swapping between display view and presenter view?
Yes, of course. Is that better?
think so. It looks a little strange to me.
How's
Is
it
that
looking
coming
for?
through for?
Is
It's not come through yet, for me at least.
hang on, let's try. Is that coming through?
It's still yeah. I think Barbara was just saying in the chat that it's still showing the presenter view. I'm not sure why it's not swapping back out.
But bear with me a sec. I think, let me just see if I can try and get this to work. Let's. Is that any better, or?
That's still on the presenter view. There we are. That's working now, Sean.
Okay, great. So sorry, everyone. Technical glitches. You can do this hundreds of times and still manage to find an opportunity where it doesn't work. But anyway, good afternoon. It's great to be with you. Thank you for your time and being with us today. In particular, thank you to Josh and to Jared at the Pegasus Institute. It's great to be partnering with you guys on this webinar. So what I want to do in this next section really is kind of take the index and unpack it a bit more in terms of what is the index saying about Kentucky. After all, I imagine that's why you came today. So what I want to do is just pull out a few insights, offer a few thoughts to you, if you like, based purely on the index and probably with a little bit of Googling. But obviously the intention here is for this index to help shape policy along the lines that Josh was talking about. And I know the Pegasus Institute have been doing some great work with data, and hopefully this index will complement the great work that they've been doing. So when we look at Kentucky, when we take that diagrammatic that Ed talked through, take those 216 indicators, normalize them, weight them, add them together to produce the kind of pillar rankings. This is what we find for Kentucky. So overall, Kentucky sits at 43rd in the index. And now you may remember from the map that we showed, that was shown as dark red, which means just actually, if it can get up to 40th, it would jump up into the next quintile, which maybe is something that we can discuss a bit further today. But when you look across the rankings table, you see there's a mixed performance according to the data in the index. So its best performing pillar is around safety and security. When you look at things like terrorism, that's such things as traditional terror, but also mass shootings. When you look at violent crime, property crime, add all those things in, it's 22nd. Market access and infrastructure, it ranks 26th, but then its performance varies all the way through to economic quality, where it currently ranks 50th. But then if we look at how prosperity has changed over the past decade, which is the chart on the left-hand side and the dark blue line for Kentucky, we see that Kentucky has improved its prosperity prior to the pandemic. And actually it's done so in a way that is slightly above the performance of all US states. And so it's moved up 2 places in the ranking. So it was 45th, it's now 43rd. And then on the right-hand side, what you see there is what's driven that improvement. Which of the pillars in particular have seen a big improvement. And there you'll see governance, according to the data in the index, and that particularly is around the rule of law element and government effectiveness element. But also we see that economic quality has improved. That was one of the main drivers of US improvement over the past decade, predominantly post the financial crisis at the end of the noughties. Obviously, currently, as the US, like many countries, are going through the pandemic, this is also an area that's going to be hit. And we'll have to see how that transpires through the indexes in the years to come. But also business environment in the open economies domain in the middle has seen an improvement. And that's what I want to spend a little bit of time looking at in particular. So here, what we see is the actual measures that make up the business environment pillar, or the elements, sorry, that make up the business environment. So we have financing ecosystems, domestic market contestability, burden of regulation, labour market flexibility, and price distortions. Now, when you look across all of these elements, taking the measures within them, we see that Kentucky has improved in the financing ecosystem. So that's access to credit, things like venture capital, but also access to foreign investment, and also price distortions, which looks at things like sort of taxes and subsidies, which can hinder the business environment. That's improved as well. As a result of those improvements, overall, we see that Kentucky has moved up 7 places in the rankings on the business environment. But actually, when you look at the other elements, you see that burden of regulation, we've captured 3 different measures within here. You know, that could be an area for Kentucky to look into, trying to see if the ways of slightly relaxing some of the regulation to help businesses thrive a bit better. But what I want to spend a little bit of time now is looking at the domestic market contestability element. So what measures, what indicators are within DMC? So this is capturing the extent of occupational licensing, which we believe can act as a barrier to creating a strong business environment. So when you look at the number of occupations in Kentucky that are subject to occupational licensing, it's quite low relative to other states, and it ranks 8th overall. But actually, when you look at the costs and the training time, they are quite high, and actually nearly 3 times as high the average in Mississippi. So just to give an example, if we look at the occupation of auctioneers, the average for the US as a whole attracts a fee of $278. It takes 94 days of education and experience and 1 exam. But if you look at Kentucky, its fees are twice as high, and actually it requires nearly 8 times as much education and experience and requires 2 exams. So one of the things that Mississippi has done over the past, actually very recently, I think it was passed in the last month or so, Governor Rees has actually recently signed legislation that makes it easier for professionals that have gained licensing in other states to actually transfer into the state without having to actually retrain. Now, this may be appropriate. It could be something that Kentucky could also consider doing to allow that transfer, so it allows greater levels of access to people with the right skills and talent. Also just want to look at education. So education in Kentucky, when we look at education, we basically break it down into the different stages of education. So we look at sort of very early pre-K-12, and then we also look at early K-12 and later K-12, and then into university through tertiary. We also capture the skill set of the adult population. And when we look at Kentucky over the past decade, we see that actually although it's improved, you can see the score 39.9 to 45.4, relative to other states, it's not improved as much. And so consequently, it's fallen 4 places in the rankings. And when you cast your eye down the table, I want to have a look at primary education, which you can see its score is actually weakened. So a decade ago, sort of early K-12 education in Kentucky, it was ranking around 9th out of all the states. Now, talking to Josh before this webinar, we were sort of discussing some of the things we might look at. He also mentioned to me that often Utah is looked at as a state which shares a lot of similarities to Kentucky. And so I just thought, well, let's see how Utah's doing on education. So this next slide just compares the 2. On the left-hand side is the table you've just seen, and on the right-hand side is the overall performance for for Utah. And if we look at primary education, you see that while Kentucky has seen a weakening of that particular aspect of education, on the right-hand side, you see that Utah has actually seen an improvement. It's gone up from 56 in the score to 66. And consequently, it's actually moved into the position that Kentucky was a decade ago in terms of the rankings. But let's unpack this a little bit more. So what are the measures that we use to capture the quality or the overall performance for primary or early K-12 education? So we use 4 measures here. We use enrollment, but we also look at test scores at grade 4 in math, reading, and science. So let's just have a quick look at how they compare. So when we look at enrollment rates, they are broadly similar. Both states have seen a slight deterioration over the past decade, but nothing too disastrous. If we look at science, we actually see that Kentucky, broadly speaking, its performance in average grade 4 science is broadly similar to what it was a decade previous. When you look at Utah, it's actually seen quite a big improvement in test scores for science at grade 4. But there isn't that much different. At the moment, there's looking broadly similar. But when we look at math and reading, this is where we see the sort of biggest difference. And we see that Kentucky is not really improved in math, whereas Utah has seen an improvement. And actually, when we look at reading, according to the data, we see that actually in Kentucky, it's a weaker performance than it was a decade ago, whereas Utah has seen a big improvement. So, you know, it could be something here around what Utah has been doing in education that may be possible learnings for Kentucky. I just put that out there. What was interesting that I noticed is that when the budget was set for 2021, which would have been around the summer of last year, I think, you know, while the pandemic was going on, Utah has, and I'm not sure what the situation is in Kentucky, but Utah has prioritized education and can actually increased its spending for that budget year. Just an observation. Now, you might be sitting there and you may well be thinking, hang on, Sean, you're giving Kentucky a bit of a hard time here. You're just showing all the things where we already know that actually we need to improve. Well, I want to sort of conclude with an example where we can put the boot on the other foot, as it were. So actually, where is Kentucky, perhaps according to the index, performing well that Utah could benefit from? You may remember from the video that we showed the key findings. We believe that the index shows opportunities for every single state to improve, and also that there are shared learnings. So rather than reinventing the wheel, can states look to other states to actually improve in areas where there are weaknesses? So if we take this particular element, connectedness, which is within the living conditions pillar, this really is trying to capture the extent to which people can connect with others in society. So here we're looking at things like urban access to broadband, rural access to broadband, but also households with a smartphone, so that ability to connect. So when we look at these three measures within connectedness, we do see quite a bit of difference. So Kentucky has actually seen quite a strong improvement in both urban access to broadband and rural access to broadband over the past decade. Now, when you look at Utah, the big challenge seems to be is improving that connectivity in rural areas. So it's currently still at just over 60%. So there's 40% of the population in Utah who aren't connected to the internet. Now, I'm not saying there aren't challenges within Kentucky around connectivity for the 20% or so that still don't have access in rural areas. And also, I know there are issues often around slow speed, but there are clearly initiatives that are in place, such as the Kentucky Wired initiative, which is looking to try and, I believe, you know, provide that middle, improve that middle sort of area of that connectivity. So again, there could be some learnings here from Kentucky for Utah in terms of what did Kentucky do in order to really improve the access to rural broadband. That's all I wanted to say on the state level analysis. There is obviously a huge amount more that can be gleaned from the index. With 48 elements, there's lots that could be further probed. But what I wanted to finish with really is that I think Ed may have mentioned this. We also, alongside the state level index, are producing a county level index. And we first published the county level index last summer. And we're doing that again this year, but we're adding 4 new states, and included within that is the 120 counties within Kentucky. So as of the summer, you will have the state level index and the county level index, which we believe complement each other in order to really help drive the best policy within the state. I will add a bit of a caveat to what I'm about to show you, because it's still work in progress. The team is still quality sharing the results, but I wanted to take the opportunity just to give you a sneak preview. So please don't hold me to anything that you see now, because it may change when we publish in July. And in standing up the county level index, we've mirrored the state level index. So we've taken those 216 indicators and we've looked to gather county level information or sub-state level information that we can use to actually really understand how prosperity is translating or being distributed across the state. So how is it looking? So this is what we find when we take those 216 indicators, 136 of which have some county variation, and we produce the same basis, we end up with this map. Now, this quite possibly may align with what you might expect, particularly as you look at the Appalachians in the southeastern corner, maybe expect to be sort of among the least prosperous within the state. And then the more prosperous are around the larger towns of Lexington and Louisville. Interestingly, Hopkinsville in the sort of towards the bottom is less prosperous, and that could be something we might want to look into. And then if we look at education, how does education distribute? Broadly similar, but not quite as such a strong Appalachian pattern here as perhaps overall prosperity. But we can also look at other aspects, and we will, when we publish later in the summer, this will allow full visibility. There are some other stark differences. So if we consider the behavioral risk factors element, which is within the health pillar, we also see some quite wide divergences across the state. So for example, when we look at obesity rates in Owsley County, they nearly stand at 50%, which is twice as high as they are in Oldham. And nearly 1 in 3 residents smoke in Macquarie County. And again, that's over twice the rate in Oldham County. So there's some real, interesting divergences and differences that we're beginning to see in the data, but we'll obviously have much more to be able to say when we pull the index in July. What we're looking to do is to continue to roll out the county level index to cover all 3,142 counties across the US, because we believe both the state and county level indexes together are really help drive the best policy and other changes that are necessary to help drive improvements in prosperity. And it's obviously, if we're able to bring in those counties for those other states that contain counties within the Appalachian region, and that would really give us a rich data set. So just wanted to say, if there's anybody out there that would like to partner with us on this work or is interested in knowing more, then please do get in touch with me. I think my details will be popped in the chat. But I did want to conclude by saying all of this information is open source. So we are a charity, and the work that we do is to benefit society. So we have a dedicated website, which is usprosperity.net, and you can go to that website and you can pull up the state profile for Kentucky, and it will give you the full range of information within the index. And then in the summer, there will be a similar profile for each of the 120 counties within the state, again, which you can go to and fully interrogate to understand where there are strengths and weaknesses. So with that, I'd just like to say thank you very much. And I'm going to hand back to Josh.
Thank you, Sean. I'm not sure if folks can see me, but they can hear my voice. The first thing is I would hear it for a long time if I let you get away with Louisville. When I moved here 6 years ago, I thought it was Louisville. I was very quickly corrected that it's Louisville. And so that can be our contribution to the education of the folks over at Legatum. But so I've got a couple of questions for you, and then we'll turn it over to Jared, who will ask some of the questions from the Q&A. So if you haven't submitted your questions to the Q&A and you have them, feel free to do that, and then Jared will ask a couple. The first question actually goes to sort of the end of what you talked about, and that's related to the data. First, this is the 2020 index, so I assume that it's not 2020 data that this is pulling from. So when is the data from? Where's the data from? How's it collected? Some of those sort of technical questions.
Do you want to take that one, Ed?
I'm very happy to take one. This is it's a really good point, and actually one of our kind of calls to action, if you like, over the past few months has been the necessity to provide data in a timely manner, so that when we do reach a crisis like this, we actually have the information that's recent, that's up to date, and allows us to react quickly. But in answer to your question, a vast majority of our data is released with either 0 years or 1 year of lag. There are only a few indicators that have 2 to 3 or more years offset. So in this year's index, we are finding that some indicators are showing the impacts of the coronavirus pandemic. Data that's produced centrally, that's widely available, such as unemployment figures. Those you can get down to very granular levels, and they're very up to date. But a lot of data is released with a fair amount of lag time. We do our best to control for that, but in our mind, it's worth keeping a very consistent approach to this, so that things don't get mixed up. So yeah, a lot of coronavirus data will be coming out in the next index, but yeah, not so much in there yet.
Yeah, if I can just add to that, I think what we have done, Josh, in building the index is use all publicly available data. So the index is a curation of what's already out there, because we don't want to be sort of creating an index that's kind of black box, contains stuff that isn't publicly available. But yeah, there is obviously the overall challenge, as I'm sure many people are facing, around the lag, lag effect. So yeah.
Well, that's great to know, and that means that the legislators on the call can take credit for some of that improvement in government accountability and efficiency. So that's good. My next question is, and this will be the last one before I turn it over to Jared. There are a number of legislators on this call, business people, members of the donor class. What should they do with this information now, right? Are there examples of states or countries, because you do this globally, that have taken this information and have improved as a result of it? What are the sort of action item takeaways for them?
Yeah, so I mean, we first set up the US index in 2019. So I feel that we're still on that journey of getting this embedded, but we're beginning to see early signs of the index being used. So I'll just give a couple of examples. One is it's actually resonated quite strongly, the index, within the health community. And I think that's partly because of the strong focus that's in the US and in lots of other countries now around social determinants of health. So rather than just looking at health outcomes, it's like, what are the upstream services that need to be dealt with because they affect health outcomes? So, people's accommodation, unemployment, even people's living environment, social capital. If strong social capital can lead to good health outcomes as well. And so it's being used by Montana State University as part of their community needs assessment of rural hospitals in the state, because it contains a lot of that information about the upstream services. We're also seeing it used by the philanthropic community as a way of assessing grant applications. So particularly at the county index, where applications are being made to address a particular challenge, the actual foundations are using the index to say, well, how is that playing out within the index? Are we seeing that reality? And then the final is we've seen it being used by 1 or 2 policy institutes, not necessarily to like a light bulb moment, but more as a way of kind of authenticating or substantiating what's already been known. So Mississippi, for example, I mentioned, they were looking to challenge or address occupational licensing. And we did a webinar there. And a few days later, we see that actually there's been an announcement. Now, I'm not saying that's causal, but I think the index can help provide that additional material to perhaps what's already known. And then the final thing I'll say is it provides a kind of holistic assessment of everything. Now, I recognize that legislators have to make decisions, they have to make trade-offs, they have to, decide on where to allocate them, the most amount of money, or how to carve up the budget pot. And the index, again, I think can help with informing that.
Jared?
Yeah, first I just want to say thank you, Sean. I got some text in, we've got some things in here saying thank you for the presentation already. One of the things Josh opened with talking about is that a lot of these prosperity indexes we see focus a lot on economic prosperity. whether it be on a global scale GDP or foreign direct investment, a lot of things that measure sort of economic prosperity, business prosperity. And one of the things that your index does is go beyond that to look at violent crime and health outcomes and air, pollution, those types of things that are very different and unique, I think, for a prosperity index. Do you think that having those indicators, something like violent crime, allows us to break down barriers to solutions? And I say that as I think violent crime is thought of as this urban problem. We don't often think of violent crime as a rural or suburban problem, but with the index, we can start to identify counties or states that might have problem areas. Do you think it can help break down those barriers to solutions by opening up that conversation?
I mean, Ed is the person who is responsible for the Inclusive Societies domain. So I'll let Ed answer that one.
I'll jump in, of course. I mean, absolutely. I think having everything contained into a single index where you can easily compare and contrast different states across this whole gamut of measures, it does open up the conversation, but it also opens up a deeper conversation as well, which is if you go to our website and you download the data and you run some analysis on it, you see that it is the counties with lower rates of violent crime that see greater rates of startups, for example. Violent crime is very definitely a hygiene issue for businesses that want to start in an area. And while policies might initially be directed to there aren't many startups in this county, what can we do to fix that? The first thought might well be we need to start up an incubator to help these startups, whereas actually the problem might be much more fundamental than that. It might be because actually this county has some of the highest rates of violent crime or indeed property crime in the state. So I think it helps to not only start but also broaden the conversations that are already going on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that was really perfect. That was really exactly what I was trying to get to, this sort of holistic approach. I think we talk about these things being cyclical at times too, that it's hard to for an urban area, it's hard for a child to excel in school when there's shootings every night. And so being able to take that holistic approach. I have one more question, and then we have a chat sort of question too that I want to get to. But my second question, we've mentioned the sort of post-pandemic, and I think for us too on the state level, we've had people asking for, what does this look like now? And of course, there's a little bit of that lag in what data, the way data comes in. But for you guys, is there areas that you're going to be particularly attentive to post-pandemic? And I say that because I think, again, to get away from economic prosperity, there's those of us that say, Wall Street will bounce back, and the hedge funds and the big companies, of course, Amazon and the Walmarts just had their biggest years ever. We might see, sort of huge numbers at the top, but overdoses still increasing and those kind of things. Are there data points that you're going to be particularly attentive to post pandemic?
Yeah, I don't think that's a really good question, Jared. And I think the impact of the pandemic, you're right, is not uniform, right? There are actually some that have benefited hugely as a result of the pandemic. You've mentioned a couple as well. So, but what I do think is that it needs to be state-led. This is not a one-size-fits-all. And I think what I do think the index is able to show is where there was a weakness before the pandemic, you can probably guarantee that it's still going to be there post the pandemic and could even be further exacerbated. So take education, for example. If education was an area of weakness before, school closures, the impact that the pandemic has had on children's education is likely to be even further exacerbated. And you've mentioned mental health. Again, that is an overall finding that we found for the US as a whole, that prior to the pandemic, it had been weakening. Now, we had seen in the latest year, when we published last year, the latest year of drug overdose deaths, actually, because it had been on an upward trajectory, it was still high, but it was lower than the year before. Now, you know, who knows how that will be, and I'm sure it will be impacted. So, but I do think it needs to be looked at a state level. There will obviously be impacts on the economy, obviously impacts on health, obviously impacts on education. But there may be some areas of the index where we see less of an impact. In fact, there may be even some improvement. So social capital, you know, during the pandemic, a lot of time we've had to rely on those relationships which count most to us, family and friends. They could have been strengthened as a result of the pandemic. So there may be some areas. It may not be all doom and gloom, but I think if there was a weakness before, it would be there again, and it probably even further exacerbated.
Mm-hmm. So I've got kind of two questions. One is a very quick one. Some people wondering if it would be a possibility for you to share the slideshow presentation with them after this. I imagine that's perfectly acceptable.
Yeah, my only slight nervousness of sharing the slides more wide is the county level stuff. Is just because we're just finessing and finalizing that. I'm very happy if I take those out, just because I wouldn't want them to get out, and then when we publish, people say, hang on, this has now all changed. I don't think it will change, but because we're doing due diligence, I'm happy to take those out and then share the slides. I'll share them with you, Jared, if that's helpful, and you can
Absolutely
share them more broadly.
Perfect. And again, to the people clamoring for that county level data, that'll be this summer, coming this summer. So watch out for that. Okay, the other question we have in here, and I wonder if this is this from Ken Fleming, a Kentucky State representative, coming off the heels of some announcements on census data just coming out in the United States. We've seen some pretty major shifts in population, of course, in the last year, population. So how they're wondering how population shifts might impact the index, and if it does, sort of how so?
Yeah, so there are a number of ways it impacts. So quite a few of the measures that we use in the index are on a per capita basis. So, you know, if the population of an area has gone up or gone down, then that will be reflected in some of the metrics. We don't actually hardwire into the index migration, and we've had this, it has come up a few times, and I think partly because we're trying to take an objective view of a state and how that has changed over time, and so we're trying to keep things fairly standard across a period so that we can track, we're comparing like with like, so we can really see whether the things have got better. But it's a good comment, but it will be reflected within the per capita measures.
I will just jump in there and add that all of our aggregations to overall scores are you know, population weighted. So, you know, if a county has, you know, a population of 100,000, then it's going to have double the impact on the state's prosperity of a county of 50,000. So it is integrated into the index in that way. I wasn't sure if that was the angle of the question.
We've got one here in the chat too that I want to get to, and I think this is a really good problem. We've kind of talked around this a little bit, but it says it seems all these problems are merely symptoms of a fundamental issue, the deterioration of the nuclear family, whether it's poverty, crime, education, underperformance. It seems that lacking that strong family support during formative years can lead to a lot of this. So the question is, has there been any attempt to formally quantify the correlation between family structure and some of these other factors?
So within the social capital pillar, what we're trying to measure within the social capital is it's almost like the glue of society, and this kind of builds on the work that, you know, Robert Putnam have done, and we also drew upon one of our experts was working for Senator Mike Lee around looking at social capital and the social fabric of US society, which is, you know, quite well documented. And so we look at social capital almost like in the sense of concentric circles. So to that point in the chat, you know, at the very center is the strength of those relationships that are most dear to us. So family, close friends. So we measure that through the personal and family relationships. You've then got your social networks, which are those relationships which slightly broader, but also very important. So this could be neighbors, you know, people that you you know, but perhaps are not quite so strongly connected with. You then move out more broadly to strangers. And then finally, the final one is around institutional trust. So actually, as well as having, people need to trust institutions, government, police, those are really strong and important institutions that need to be trusted. The final thing that we measure is around civic and social participation. So the extent to which people are engaged in their community and their society. So taking active responsibility for making their community a healthy place to live.
I was just going to jump in there if that's right as well, and just say, we haven't done correlations against family structure specifically, but all of our data is freely available on our website, and this is one of the things that we're trying to get engagement on, is that this is absolutely a question that could be answered using our data, or at least assisted with our data. If you have the data on average family structure or family size, and you somehow quantify that, that's absolutely some analysis that can be done with our work.
Sean and Ed, I've got what might be the last question, depending on how long the answers go. In the county level data, how do you deal with counties with large cities? So here in Kentucky, for example, Jefferson County is the home of Louisville. East end of Louisville, economically prosperous, low crime rates, strong private schools. West end of Louisville, minimal access to private schools, higher crime rates, higher rates of poverty. So the county itself is probably going to come out somewhere in the middle, but the experiences within the county are very different. Do you account for that at all?
I mean, again, I think, yeah, you make a really good point, Josh. And I think, what we've tried to do with the index is construct it in a way that best informs the level at which policy decisions are often made. Obviously, a lot of decisions are made at state level, but also there's a lot of decisions made at county level. Now, that's not to say that decisions are not made at a sub-county level, and they will be, particularly to your point, if you've got a large metropolitan area within a county. The challenge is that actually, data availability. So as soon as you start going, even when we've gone from state to county, I was actually quite surprised how much data we could find, but we still have a number of indicators within the index where we've identified that there is county variation. So for some of the indicators, if you look at sort of whether a particular law has been enacted within a state, if it has, then it's equally applicable to all counties, and therefore you give it the same score. But there will be some where there is county, but there isn't the data available. So what we've had to do there is just use the state average for every county. So no county is kind of penalized, but it's not quite as strong or good as it could be. And if you go below county, that's going to even be further exacerbated. So absolutely, it does mask a bit of a difference, I think. But to your point, it can identify for the county as a whole where there's strengths and weaknesses. And we always say with the index is it's a starting point for a conversation. It should be used alongside other information, more local contextualized information, to really inform the decision making.
All right, we're coming up on our end time here, and I want to say this before our attendees start to exit, or if they have other obligations. Thank you again to Sean and Ed and everybody over at Legatum. I practiced all week on how to say that, and I still don't know if I said it correctly right there, but nonetheless, we are extremely appreciative. And finally, this has been recorded, and so if there are people, legislators listening who want to refer back to it or would like to, share it beyond that, we're going to be able to send that out. And so people who may not have been able to attend, you'll be able to watch the entire conversation and then hopefully dive in some more on their website. But again, thank you to everybody for joining. Thank you to our panelists, and that wraps things up. So again, this was really great, and we hope to see everybody in person very soon. But for now, we'll stick with the webinars. But thank you again to everybody.